All right, so we're diving deep into multinational enterprises
Those global giants, yeah.
that seem to be everywhere you look.
It's amazing, isn't it, how these massive organizations operate across borders, cultures, markets. It's incredible.
And to help us unpack all of this, we've got a team of experts who literally rate the book on international business strategy.
No kidding, international business strategy and cross-cultural management, an applied approach. What a title, right?
It is quite a mouthful, but it's like having our own personal dream team of international business
It
gurus.
really is.
So first up, we have Nicole Franziska Richter,
Professor at the University of Southern Denmark.
focusing on the cross-cultural side of things. She's like our decoder ring for understanding how cultural differences impact business decisions.
Absolutely. And then we have Jesper Stranskov. Over 30 years of experience in international business. He's the one who's seen it all.
The guy who can tell us how the theory actually plays out in the real world.
Exactly.
Then there's Fen Hoff,
Our human resource management expert.
from Helmut Schmidt University.
Yeah, he's all about the people side of things, how to manage the human element in these global businesses.
Which, let's be honest, is a huge part of the equation.
Absolutely. And last but not least, Vassal Terrace.
Bridging the gap between academic theory and practical experience.
He's an associate professor at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro and the director of the X-Culture Project.
Which is a massive global collaboration for business students.
Yeah,
So he's bringing real-world application to the table.
definitely.
It's an all-star lineup.
For sure. Their book covers so much ground. It's amazing.
It does. Entering foreign markets, forming partnerships, navigating cultural differences.
And designing those organizational structures.
The structures that actually work.
Right. It's a gold mine of insights.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we're zeroing in on Chapter 7.
The organizational structures of MNEs, it's like looking under the hood of these global companies.
Right. How are they designed? How do they make decisions? How does information flow? How do they succeed?
Exactly. Think of it like, imagine a giant ship navigating the high seas of global commerce.
Okay, I like where you're going with this.
The organizational structure is the blueprint for that ship. It determines how all the parts fit together, how they communicate, how efficiently it all works to reach that destination.
That's a great analogy. And what's interesting is Chapter 7 shows how these structures have evolved over time. It's not just about that old school hierarchical chart anymore.
Right. For years, that top-down command and control system was a gold standard. Headquarters made all the decisions, and the subsidiaries just followed orders.
But the business world is so much more dynamic and complex now, right?
It is. Think about it. The rise of emerging markets, the internet, global competition,
They're constantly changing.
and that old hierarchical model. It's like trying to steer a giant oil tanker through a narrow, winding canal. You need something more nimble, more adaptable.
Okay, so what's the alternative?
Heterarchical models. Think networks. More fluid, collaborative, responsive.
I'm picturing a jazz band. Each musician contributes their own expertise, but there's no strict hierarchy. They improvise, communicate, create something amazing together.
That's it. It's about breaking down those traditional silos within a company and empowering employees to be more proactive, more innovative.
So instead of waiting for instructions from headquarters, employees on the front lines can respond to changes, customer needs.
Exactly. This shift towards collaboration, network-based structures, it's happening everywhere. Companies are realizing adaptability and innovation are key to survival.
Makes sense. So Chapter 7 digs into these different structures, starting with those traditional hierarchical ones, right?
Right. The functional, the geographic area, the product division.
That's like a history lesson in organizational design.
It is. But each structure has its limitations, especially in today's complex global landscape.
So let's break them down. What's the functional structure all about?
Well, it's all about grouping employees by their skills. Marketing folks with marketing folks, finance with finance, and so on. It can be very efficient, especially for companies that need a high degree of specialization.
Right. If you're producing a limited range of products, operating in a stable market,
It could be a good fit.
but there's a catch.
There is. It can lead to what we call silo thinking. Departments become so focused on their own tasks that they lose sight of the big picture.
Each department becomes its own little island.
And communication breaks down, which is a real problem in a fast-paced market. You need everyone working together seamlessly.
Okay, so that's the functional structure. What about the geographic area structure?
That one's about organizing around different regions. So you might have a North American division, a European division, an Asian division.
Tailoring your products and strategies to those specific regions.
Exactly. But there are downsides.
Like what?
Duplication of efforts. You might have multiple teams doing similar tasks in different regions, and it can be difficult to maintain consistency, your brand, your messaging.
So it's a trade-off.
Yeah.
Local responsiveness versus global efficiency.
Exactly. And then there's the product vision structure,
Yeah.
commonly used by companies with diverse product lines.
Like Procter& Gamble. They've got everything from shampoo to laundry detergent to diapers.
Right. It wouldn't make sense to manage all those under one giant structure.
So they create separate divisions for each category.
Right. Each with its own marketing team, sales team, R&D.
So each division can focus on its specific products and target markets.
Exactly. Leads to greater innovation, responsiveness.
But I imagine coordination between divisions could be a challenge.
Absolutely. You can end up with divisions competing for resources. It can be tough to maintain a consistent brand image.
And if those divisions are operating in the same markets.
Oh, it gets even more complicated.
So each of these traditional structures has its pros and cons.
The best choice depends on the company's specific needs.
And it's not about picking one and sticking with it forever.
Yeah.
Companies evolve, they grow, they face new challenges.
Their structures need to evolve too?
Speaking of evolving, what about that matrix structure we hear so much about? The one that tries to combine the best of both worlds.
Ah, the matrix, the dream of having your cake and eating it too.
Right.
It tries to overcome the limitations of those traditional hierarchies. Employees report to both a functional manager and a product or geographic area manager.
So instead of one boss, you have two.
Exactly. Two bosses, different priorities, different perspectives. The idea is to create a more collaborative organization. Employees can leverage their expertise across different functions, product lines.
But it sounds like a recipe for confusion. Conflicting priorities, who's in charge?
You're right. It can get messy, it's complex, difficult to manage. It needs trust, communication, clear decision-making.
The chapter mentioned some companies have tried it. Dow Chemicals, BASF, ABB.
With mixed results.
It can be effective if it's done right.
But it can also create more problems than it solves. Which brings us to those more flexible approaches we talked about. The heterarchical models.
Okay, let's dive into those. I'm really curious about these.
They're fascinating, and they're becoming more and more popular, especially as companies try to adapt to a rapidly changing world. Let's start with the network structure.
Perfect. So what is a network structure? How does it work?
Forget the pyramid. Imagine a web, interconnected units. It's about breaking down those departmental silos, fostering collaboration, knowledge sharing.
Teams working together across functions, geographic boundaries.
Sharing information, making decisions together.
This sounds like it would be especially effective for companies in dynamic industries, where innovation and responsiveness are key.
Exactly. But it requires a different kind of leadership, a different culture.
Right. Leaders who are comfortable delegating, empowering their teams.
Trust and transparency.
It's not just about changing the org chart, it's about changing the mindset.
Exactly. That's often the hardest part.
It makes me think of those tech startups, the ones disrupting entire industries. They tend to have those flat, network-based structures.
They understand that agility is everything.
Okay, so that's the network structure. What about the transnational model?
The transnational model takes the network concept even further.
How so?
It recognizes that each subsidiary has its own unique strengths.
So it's not just about subsidiaries following orders.
Right. They contribute to the global strategy. They share knowledge, expertise.
It's a truly integrated network.
Exactly. But it requires a lot of trust, coordination
Strong leadership.
at both the headquarters and subsidiary levels. But the potential, huge.
What kind of potential?
Think about it. The chapter analyzes the top 100 most international firms,
Okay.
the ones with more decentralized transnational structures. They tend to perform better financially.
So there's evidence that these models can give companies a competitive edge.
Exactly. They can tap into a wider range of perspectives, respond quicker to market changes, drive innovation.
And I'm sure there are challenges,
Yeah.
right?
Of course, nothing's perfect.
So what are some of the hurdles companies face when moving away from those traditional hierarchies, embracing these more collaborative approaches?
Control and coordination. It can get chaotic without clear communication, decision-making processes.
And I bet it's a culture shock for companies used to operating in that hierarchical way.
It is. It requires a shift in mindset.
For both leaders and employees.
Right. You have to let go of some control, empower your teams, trust them to make good decisions.
It takes work to create a culture that supports these structures.
It does. It doesn't happen overnight. but the rewards can be significant.
This has been really insightful. We've covered so much ground already. The evolution of MNE structures, from those hierarchies to the more collaborative models.
It's amazing to see how business is evolving, how companies are finding new ways to organize themselves.
In part 2, we'll dig deeper into how MNEs coordinate their activities, the roles subsidiaries play, the case of Procter & Gamble.
A company that's gone through some incredible transformations.
It's a fascinating story. Stay tuned.
So we've talked about how M&Es are shifting toward these more collaborative structures.
Right.
But even in a jazz band, you need some rhythm, some coordination,
You
right?
can't just have everyone improvising all the time. You need some kind of framework to keep things on track.
Exactly. And that's where coordination mechanisms come in.
Okay.
Chapter 7 breaks these down into 3 main categories: centralization, formalization, and socialization.
Let's unpack those one by one. Starting with centralization. What does that even mean in the context of an M&E?
It's all about who's calling the shots, who has the power to make decisions. In a highly centralized structure, most decisions are made at headquarters.
So it's like that classic top-down approach. Everything flows from the top.
Exactly. This can be efficient, especially for maintaining consistency and control, but it can also be slow, inflexible.
Especially in today's fast-paced global environment.
Right, because if a subsidiary has to wait for headquarters to make every decision, they might miss opportunities or be slow to respond to local market changes.
So it's all about finding the right balance. Global strategy versus local responsiveness.
Exactly. And that leads us to formalization. This
Okay.
is all about using rules, procedures, systems to coordinate those activities across the M&E.
So think standardized processes, performance metrics, regular reporting, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Formalization helps create consistency and efficiency. It's like making sure everyone is working from the same playbook.
So things don't fall through the cracks.
Yeah.
People aren't working at cross purposes.
Right. But of course, too much formalization can stifle creativity, make the organization slow and bureaucratic. It's all about finding the right balance.
So it seems like coordination in MNEs is all about walking a tightrope between control and flexibility.
You got it. And then we have socialization,
Okay.
which is a little more nuanced. It's about creating a shared culture,
Yeah.
a set of values that guide behavior throughout the organization.
So it's less about rules and procedures
Right.
and more about creating a shared understanding, what the company stands for, how it operates.
Exactly. Think about things like company-wide training programs, leadership development initiatives, even social events, bringing employees together from different parts of the world.
So it's about building relationships, fostering trust, creating that sense of community across the M&E.
Precisely. And this is especially important in a globalized world. Companies need to bridge those cultural differences, create a unified sense of purpose.
The chapter also mentions that M&Es need to think about the local context when choosing these coordination mechanisms.
Absolutely. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
So what works in one country or region might not work in another.
Right. A company operating in a highly regulated market, they might need a more centralized structure, more formalization, but a company in a more dynamic, entrepreneurial market might benefit from a more decentralized, informal approach.
Makes sense.
It's about being adaptable,
Right.
tailoring your approach to each situation.
And that brings us to another interesting piece of the puzzle: subsidiary roles and mandates.
Right. Because even though we're talking about coordination and collaboration, each subsidiary has its own unique role to play.
Chapter 7 really emphasizes that subsidiaries aren't just about following orders.
Right.
It's about leveraging their strengths, their resources.
To contribute to the overall success.
Exactly.
Think of it like this. A subsidiary might be a center of excellence for a particular product or technology, or they might have deep knowledge of a specific market.
So they become a valuable asset to the M&E.
Exactly. And the chapter introduces this really helpful framework for understanding these different roles. It's a typology by Bartlett and Goschel. It categorizes subsidiaries based on 2 things: the strategic importance of the local market and the competencies of that subsidiary.
Okay, let's break down those categories.
All right. First, you have strategic leaders. These are subsidiaries that operate in those key markets, and they often possess unique competencies that are really critical to the M&E's success. They're given a lot of autonomy, often tasked with developing new products, processes. things that can be leveraged across the whole company.
So they're kind of like the star players on a sports team. You rely on them to make the big plays.
Exactly. Then you have contributors.
hmm
They might operate in smaller markets, less strategically important markets, but they still have those distinctive competencies that make them valuable.
So they might not be the stars of the show, but they're still making important contributions.
Right. They might be experts in a niche market, or they might have developed the unique process that can be replicated.
And then we have implementers.
These are the ones focused on executing that global strategy in their local markets. They might not have as much autonomy as strategic leaders or contributors, but they play a vital role in making sure the MNEs, products, services, reach customers around the world.
So they're the ones who keep the trains running on time.
Exactly. They're essential for ensuring smooth operations.
It seems like finding the right role for each subsidiary is crucial.
Absolutely. And that's where strategic thinking comes in. MNEs need to carefully assess each subsidiary, their strengths, weaknesses, and determine how they can best contribute.
And of course, there's that black hole scenario we want to avoid.
Right. The chapter mentions this as a cautionary tale. It's that situation where a subsidiary operates in an important market, but it lacks the competencies to really be successful.
So they're stuck, unable to contribute effectively.
Exactly. It drains resources, can even damage the company's reputation.
And Chapter 7 goes even further, suggesting breaking down those subsidiary roles even more
Right.
by analyzing how they specialize along the value chain.
Are they focused on innovation, production,
Yeah.
sales, administration? Understanding this can help the MNE optimize its global operations.
It's like a complex puzzle. You have to make sure all the pieces fit together.
That's a great way to put it. And it highlights the strategic thinking that's needed to manage that global network.
It's fascinating how complex and nuanced these roles can be.
And that complexity brings us to the next section, power dynamics and conflict.
Because even when we talk about collaboration, there's always an element of competition, tension between different parts of the organization.
Of course, even in the most collaborative environments, people are competing for resources, recognition, influence,
And in an MNE, this plays out between headquarters and subsidiaries.
or even between different subsidiaries.
It's like a giant game of chess.
Exactly. Each subsidiary trying to make the best moves to advance their own position.
But the chapter argues that this competition isn't always a bad thing.
Right.
It can actually drive innovation, efficiency.
Exactly. If subsidiaries are constantly trying to prove their worth, outdo each other,
It pushes them to be more creative.
more resourceful.
But it needs to be managed carefully,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Too much competition becomes destructive. It undermines the overall goals.
So how do MNEs manage these power dynamics? How do they prevent things from spiraling out of control?
Chapter 7 identifies 3 key determinants of subsidiary bargaining power:
Okay.
resource control, legitimacy, and centrality.
Resource control. That seems pretty straightforward. If a subsidiary controls something the MNE needs, it gives them leverage.
Exactly. Think about a subsidiary that has developed a unique technology, or access to a critical raw material, or maybe they have strong relationships with key customers in a market. That gives them power.
They're holding some valuable cards.
Right. Then there's legitimacy. This is about being seen as a valuable and trustworthy part of the MNE, both internally and externally.
So it's not just about what you have, it's about how you're perceived.
Exactly. A subsidiary with a strong track record, known for ethical practices, a good reputation, they'll have more influence.
It's about building a strong brand.
Exactly. And then there's centrality. This is all about the subsidiary's position within the network.
So it's about being connected, having influence throughout the organization.
Exactly. The more connections a subsidiary has, the more influential they become. And the chapter has a really interesting model. It maps out different levels of influence based on a subsidiary's internal and external embeddedness.
So it's not just about the subsidiary itself, it's about their position in the bigger picture.
Precisely. It's a complex interplay of factors. And this brings us to a real-world example.
Okay.
Procter & Gamble, a company that's been through so many changes.
I'm excited to hear this, how they've navigated these complexities, the structures, the coordination
Yeah.
over the years.
Their story really highlights how organizational structure isn't static. It needs to evolve as a company grows, as its goals change.
That's a great place to pause.
Yeah.
We'll pick up with P&G's evolution in part 3.
We'll see how they've experimented with different structures, navigated those power dynamics, and ultimately found ways to thrive in a rapidly changing global marketplace.
Welcome back to our deep dive.
Mhm.
We've been exploring these multinational enterprises, these
These
MNEs,
global giants, yeah.
and I think it's time to bring it all back to you, the listener.
We can talk about structures and mechanisms all day.
But it's really about how this all connects to you. Whether you're working for a huge company or just starting out, understanding how these M&Es work,
It can give you a real edge.
it's like understanding the rules of the game.
Exactly.
So remember that question for the beginning. If you were in charge of a global company, what kind of structure would you choose?
That traditional hierarchy.
With clear lines of authority?
Mm.
Or would you go for a more decentralized, network-based model?
Empowering subsidiaries to make decisions, encouraging collaboration.
There's no right or wrong answer, of course.
It depends on the company, its goals, its industry.
But it's a good thought experiment to think about the pros and cons of each approach.
Definitely. And then there's that other interesting question about those internal struggles, the power dynamics. Could they actually be a source of innovation?
It's a bit of a paradox, isn't it?
It is, because those competitions, they can create friction.
Slow things down.
Right.
But they can also push people to be more innovative, more efficient,
It's like that saying, iron sharpens iron. A little bit of competition can make everyone better.
as long as it's healthy competition.
Exactly. Too much and it becomes toxic.
It undermines the collaboration.
The leaders of the MNE have to find that balance. A culture that encourages healthy competition, but also promotes cooperation, a shared sense of purpose.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think the biggest one is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution, no magic formula for organizational structure.
It's about finding the right fit for the company.
It's strategy, it's culture.
And it's not a one-time decision. It's an ongoing process. Companies change, markets change, industries are disrupted.
You have to be willing to adapt, adjust your structure to stay ahead of the curve.
Agility is key. And that brings us to another important point, effective coordination.
Right. Whether it's through centralization, formalization, or socialization, MNEs need to find ways to keep everyone on the same page.
Even when they're spread across the globe. Different cultures, different time zones.
Take strong leadership, clear communication, and a culture of trust.
And I think the final takeaway is that the business world never stands still.
Things are constantly changing.
What works today might not work tomorrow.
Stay curious, keep learning, and don't be afraid to try new things.
Maybe someday you'll be leading that global enterprise, putting all this knowledge into practice. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
We hope you found it insightful.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.